So just in the spirit of Shavuot,
Yeah.
we talked about Genesis chapter 10 has 70 nations, both in later in Genesis, I think it's 46, then Exodus, we have 70 Israelites coming down to Egypt. So 70 nations, 70 Israelites. Deuteronomy 32 ties them together. He divided up the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. Now that's biblical text, right? You read Genesis 32, you need to have remembered and counted, paid attention enough to count that there were 70 nations in Genesis 10. And it's not just in Genesis 10. That was the ancient concept that there were 70 nations in the world. Genesis 10 just tells us what those 70 nations are in the known world at the time. And you have 70 Israelites that came down to Egypt. Now, you have those two numbers. They're tied together in Genesis 32 or in Deuteronomy 32 in the Song of Moses. That's all biblical Tanakh stuff. In Jewish tradition, there's a discussion about the Ten Commandments. Now, I have a teaching called Shavuot, Feast of Oaths, over on nehemiaswall.com as one of the support team studies. And what I show there is that Shavuot is the only feast day for which a date is not given. Mm-hmm. We know it's in the third month, 50 days after the beginning of the counting of the Omer, but the range of dates can be anywhere from the 4th of the third month, of the third Hebrew month, to the 15th of the third Hebrew month. That's quite a range. Mm-hmm. And the date is intentionally not given because it's based on the Sunday during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, during what we call colloquially Passover. Now, Shavuot is in the beginning of the third Hebrew month. Every one of the feasts has a historical event assigned to it, as well as an agricultural event. So the agricultural event of Passover is the barley harvest, the beginning of the barley harvest. The one for Sukkot, the third feast, is the ingathering of the crops from the field, and from the processing of the crops from the field. And for Shavuot, it's the wheat harvest. So we've got barley, wheat, and fully processing the grains. Those are the three feasts. The historical events is obvious for a Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? It's that they had unleavened bread when they left Egypt because they were in a hurry. For Sukkot, it is they dwelt in booths. What about Shavuot? So the historical event tied to Shavuot is never explicitly stated, but it is, from the earliest Jewish sources, we are told that it is the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Mm. When did that take place? If you read, it's very clear in Exodus, it took place in the beginning of the third Hebrew month. What date? We're not told. We're told about the third Hebrew month, and then we count 3 days. But we don't even know what really date in the third Hebrew month. So sometime early in the third Hebrew month is when God revealed his word on Mount Sinai. Apparently at Shavuot, or Shavuot then is understood to remember that. At very least, you can't dispute that the two coincide as being early in the third Hebrew month without a definitive date. And it might be that's why we don't have a definitive date for the revelation at Sinai, because it would be tied to Shavuot, which doesn't have a definitive date. So Jewish tradition said, a mixed multitude left Egypt. When they heard God speak at Mount Sinai, what if they didn't speak Hebrew? Right? The whole thing is the entire congregation of Israel, not just the children of Israel. The entire congregation of Israel heard God with their own ears. So the Jewish tradition extrapolates and they say, well, if you were a Canaanite and you heard the Ten Commandments, you must have heard it in your own language.
Amen.
And if you were a Philistine, one of the mixed multitudes who left Egypt, and you heard the Ten Commandments, you must have heard it in the Philistine language. And if you were a Libyan and you heard the Ten Commandments, you must have heard it in your own language. And if you were a Cushite, a Nubian, and you heard the Ten Commandments, you must have heard it in your own language. So what essentially Jewish tradition is doing is extrapolating based on the idea that we're told the whole congregation of Israel heard it. And how could it be that God spoke in Hebrew, but the Nubian heard it in his language? Because it's God speaking. He can do miracles. Yeah. And so the tradition says that God spoke these words, and they were heard in 70 different languages. Now, Acts chapter 2 describes an event in the history of the church, in the history of the Yeshua movement, where the people come together on what Jewish festival? Shavuot. And what happens? People start speaking in different languages. And these weren't gibberish languages. These were languages that people understood. And why were they doing that? Because they were Jewish people from the diaspora who came from Rome, who didn't understand Hebrew. They were Jewish people from the diaspora who came from Tarsus, who maybe didn't understand Hebrew. They were Jewish people from the diaspora who came from Yemen, who maybe didn't understand Hebrew. This was the Feast of Weeks. People came from all over the Jewish diaspora, and instead of just speaking in Hebrew or possibly Aramaic, they were able to somehow, according to the book of Acts, right? They had the Pentecostal event or experience, speaking in tongues, which at that time meant speaking in the language which each person could understand, just like at Mount Sinai. So whether you believe that has happened or not, the Yosef, the Orthodox Jew who wrote to me, maybe he doesn't believe that happened. That's okay. My question isn't what happened in the first century in this case. My question is, what is the book of Acts trying to communicate? And I have no doubt in my mind that the book of Acts is trying to communicate that this was a Mount Sinai type event. That just as God revealed the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, now a message was being revealed that would be understood by all the nations of the world.